Thank you, everyone. We're a couple of minutes late. We've had a slightly pushed morning. This is a hybrid meeting of the Finance, Audit and Risk, or Audit, Finance and Risk Committee. So we do have some folk online. I don't believe that we have any councillors though. And I note John Gamba is online. He has caught some lurg from someone and is not speaking too much, but he will be listening intently. It was nothing to do with me. So welcome in. We have a full meeting. We have some challenging papers in front of us, particularly within the PX part of the deal, and we will be having, I think, hopefully a broad conversation. But if I could hand over to Ian Cranwell for a welcome, thank you.
Ko tēnei te ruru, te kaukau mai nei ki hai mā, hititi ki hai mā, raka tūpaka nui o te ruru, te reko, hepo, he ao ka awa titi hei wā mauri ora. Anei rā te mihi ki au kutuka tō e rau i ka mai tēnei rā. Hai ke raro i te manu atia a matariki tēnei wā, I puta mai a matariki te pai tawhiti i te ata nei, no reira. He whakaaro mō rātou, ko weha tiki te pō, mo te tau ko hipa, ia tātou I tēnei wā, mo te mahi whanaungatanga, whakakotahitanga, mo te tau kei te heki mai nei, ke raro te whetū wa hiwa I te rangi, mo ngā moe ā me ngā wawata, no reira huri noa te whare nei, tēnā koutou, tēnā tata katoa. Just me to everyone with the rising of Matariki, the thoughts of the past, being present together today and also looking to the future for our dreams and our aspirations. So hope everyone has a wonderful Matariki holiday tomorrow, the first Indigenous holiday that Aotearoa will have, and enjoy the long weekend. Kia ora tātou.
Thank you, Ian. We have a quorum. Do we have any apologies? We have one for lateness from the chair, Jenny Yui. No further apologies, then I have that apology for lateness noted, please. Conflicts of interest, I do not believe there are any. There are no public forums, deputations or petitions. Do members have any matters of extraordinary or urgent business to bring to the table? There are none. There are not, to my knowledge, any notices of motion. We will then move to item 7.1. The unconfirmed minutes of the Audit, Finance and Risk Committee 26 May, and I'll ask Giles to speak with one minor correction.
Thank you, Chair. Just under item 8.4, the Treasury Policy Review, the Resolution 2 should refer to the Long-Term Plan 2434, not 2333. A correction could be made.
Thank you, Giles. Are there any further alterations or corrections required by members? If not, could I then have someone please move and second that they be taken as a true and correct record? Councillor Mackay moved, Councillor Ian McKenzie second. Those in favour please say aye. Against? Carried. We now move to item 8.1 reports. Audit, Finance and Risk Committee Resolution Status Report. Giles.
So this is just the standing item ensuring that we monitor and follow the resolutions that Council has made, gives an indication of where they've been completed or whether they're in progress. Happy to take any questions or comments.
If there are no questions or comments, could I then have someone please move and second that we note the status of the previous Timatanga, Granville, Councillor Edge. All those in favour please say aye. Against? Carried. Item 8.2, outstanding management actions from internal audits, external reviews and previous meetings. Giles.
So again, standing agenda item following up on previous audits and significant external reviews. The key point to note for the committee is that the internal audit of past audits and significant external reviews is an agenda item for this meeting, which will then allow us to populate this report and the similar report in PX going forward.
we have any questions of clarification? Graham McGlynn.
Thank you. Just noting the matter raised in previous meetings on the Moss report for the extension of the concept of that review to other vessels.
Tim Davey, do you have a response?
Thank you, Chair, and through you. So just to explain that I'm the director that has oversight around the Marine Transport Operating Plan that the MOS comes under. The audit that is done by Maritime New Zealand is on our systems and processes. And in our systems and processes, we have an annual survey done on all of our boats. So the audit that was reported on was the audit of our processes, including the annual survey. Now, in doing that audit, they check one boat to check that our surveys line up with what they would expect. So, and then they follow through on the paperwork that the annual surveys have been done. So I can report that annual surveys are done on all of our vessels, and then we report back that through to the Marine Transport, Maritime New Zealand.
Through the chair, thank you for that clarification. I wasn't aware from the papers presented that it was actually done on all vessels annually.
Thank you. Any further questions or clarifications? If there are none, then we have the three recommendations in your papers and on the screen. May I please have someone move and second those recommendations? Councillor Mackay, Councillor Marshall, all those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. Thank you. Item 8.3, Audit, Finance and Risk Committee Forward Work Plan. John Gamba wants to speak to this.
Thank you, Chair. So, as previously indicated to the committee, this is our initial view of a rolling forward work programme for this committee to give a sense of when items will be coming on the agenda. This will allow us to track new items and to give visibility about what's coming in the future. A couple of things to note is that we are also developing an associated work programme for the committee, and there are a couple of items listed in the papers, such as the land strategy and a comprehensive asset register and a multi-year capital programme that we will give visibility in future meetings. Other things to note is obviously the schedule of meetings for when the new council is appointed have yet to be agreed. We have assumed we would continue to meet with the same frequency, but that will obviously be subject to confirmation. And then we've also had further conversations with members of this committee since we produced this work programme and have identified that it would be useful to include regular updates on key people-related metrics. So a report on people-related information such as annual leave balances, and also covering things like gift register and conflicts of interest agenda item going forward. So those will be added to the forward work programme, to the forward rolling agenda. And we will continue to keep this live and welcome feedback on an ongoing basis from members of the committee.
Graham Naylor.
Thank you, Chair. Subsequent to our workshop yesterday, I went away and gave this some further thought, and I've had some additional items which I think should be considered. But rather than take up the time in this meeting today, can I suggest I communicate those to the chair and to Giles, and you can decide whether we or how we bring those back to the committee. But I think we could really look at this in a much more broad way if we're serious about trying to get this to be a high-performing committee.
Thank you, Graham. And I think we will take the opportunity and just for members' knowledge, we are on an ongoing basis every 2 to 3 months now, just having an informal meeting between the independent members, myself, John Gambit, Giles and the like, just to sit down and talk about these issues, things that they are seeing that are coming through the communities that they are actively engaged and involved in. So it's an opportunity there to have those conversations and work through what might be appropriate to us. And part of the role of the two Grahams is to bring those ideas and thoughts to this table and lift us up in our processes. So thank you for that, and we will take that on board.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, look, I really welcome this. It was great that you've managed to have this interim report following on from our last meeting. So it's really good to see. My only query really is just ensuring that you're satisfied with the time frames of delivery of these various items, that anything that might be required for the next consideration of the next long-term plan is adjusted if you need to. I'm thinking there of any policy review statements that might be needed.
Thanks, Councillor Edge. I think that's a lens that we will apply through it. As I mentioned, I think at the last committee, we are looking to establish the investment working group or investment committee, which one of the lenses that I'm talking to the chair about is making sure that we are undertaking the work through that will come through this committee or to council on potential changes to policies that would help inform the next LTP in particular. So, but it's certainly something that we will bear in mind as the programme. And if committee members identify things that they think should be reviewed or brought to this committee in advance of the LTP, then this is one of the reasons we're producing this.
Any further questions or clarifications? If not, could I then have someone please move and second? Thank you, Grant Hedge, Councillor Southworth. All those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. We move then to item 8.4, portfolio health and financial health. Jasmine and or Brian.
Obviously, we'll take most of the paper as read. As a quick overview, the organisation is obviously performing better than budget in most areas at the point in time. 4 out of the 5 portfolios have improved performance with either increased surpluses or lower deficits during the period. A question was raised previously about the summary graph on page 38 of the surplus and deficits and an explanation around that relative to the LTP. In actual fact, that graph is a graph of actual against the variance to budget. So the semi-budget columns in that graph will not relate directly back to the LTP as such. But in terms of a brief overall summary, the water and land portfolio is experiencing a lower deficit than was budgeted in the LTP, and this is primarily due to delays in payments to the Hekio Hines Trust. The biodiversity portfolio is moving into surplus where a deficit had previously been budgeted for in the LTP, and at this present time it's due to a slight scaling back and work in the Wallabies and Wilding Pines area and less income from NPI for those purposes. The climate change portfolio is experiencing a higher surplus than budgeted. This is largely due to additional income coming in from NEMA for the recovery post-flood. And we're expecting that surplus to continue down to the bottom line for the rest of the year so that we can actually pay for the capital expenditure involved in that. The air quality and PT portfolio is experiencing a higher deficit for the reasons we have discussed in previous months in terms of the impact of PT patronage, etc. And the regional leadership portfolio is experiencing a lower deficit. than budgeted due to various discretionary projects and governance events that did not proceed during the period. So there is a mix, but we are expecting the year to finish better than budget currently. Exactly how much we are yet aware, given we're now still 10 days out from the end of the year, and there's a bit of work to be done in terms of accruals and wrapping up some of the entries, etc. obviously, but we are expecting that we will be able to recover that $1 million promised for next year's annual plan, with some extra as required. So any questions?
Those are the financial results, counting the dollars in and out. I'm interested more in the outputs aspects that are important in a governmental or not-for-profit type entity, and how are we tracking with outputs from that we had said we were going to do with this year's expenditure predominantly, and can you give us any guidance on projects which we have perhaps not delivered as well on, or having to be rolled forward, which leads into the question as to whether the $1 million you just referred to is actually real or illusory.
Obviously, in terms of that information, we are reliant on the program managers to report to us. Our understanding of the position is, and it flows into the work we have done in terms of funding carry forwards into the new financial year, that there is only minor areas of delay and expected uncompleted work by the end of the year at this point. There certainly has been no major transfers forward of budget at this point. There is some issue in terms of timing around things like the grants for wallabies and wilding pines, etc. But that's more about funding crossing the end of year periods, etc., than it is about unfinished work at this point.
Thanks, Chair. I just had a query on page 43 concerning the Heinz Hekia project. It looks like there were some delays in finalising the agreement, and the sum of 850,000 to be paid in June. It would be, I'm sure councillors would welcome an updated report, perhaps through the Chief Executive, about that project, including the finances and the agreement, just as a reminder of where we're at, and perhaps also bringing forward some information about the nitrate situation on that project. It's of interest to our communities, but at least it looks like the expenditure issue's been sorted.
Thank you, Grant. I guess just a wee bit challenged by your questions. We have signed a contract with the Hekia Heinz Trust to transfer the monies that have been levied in that community for it. So yeah, I think that piece is underway. The question as to the functions of that committee and the environmental outcomes, I'm not sure whether they sit within the remit of this committee and might well be better addressed to one of the other committees that have that role to bring through.
That's what I'm suggesting, perhaps if the Chief Executive could work with whoever in the organisation to come back perhaps with a briefing update on where we're at with that project, and just to refresh our minds about what the project was about, really for transparency about an issue, both the funding, the organisation of that trust, and the results and anticipated results of the MAR project, and whether it's likely to deliver what it's supposed to deliver.
I'm sure that can be achieved in the appropriate committee, and if there are any challenges, then they may come through as a risk to this committee, but I think we can facilitate that conversation in the appropriate committee. Thank you. Any further questions, clarifications? If there are none, could I then have someone please move and second the portfolio health and financial report as is sitting on the screen? Graham McGlynn, Claire Mackay. Those in favour, please say aye. Against? Carried. We move now to item 8.5, and thank you, Brian. Page 44, recovery projects COVID-19. Nick Daniels.
Good afternoon, Chair, and good afternoon, Committee. Look, I'll take the paper as read and just make some key points if that's okay through the Chair. Firstly, I'd like to just apologise for the table on pages 57 and 58 of your pack appearing where they do in the report. They should have followed after page 46, which would have made for more logical reading. The table on page 45 shows the changes in status of projects, focusing on the deliverables which have been agreed with the respective funding agencies. I'd like to draw the committee's attention to the comment regarding the Wallaby project. At the end of April, there was a concern that we would not be able to execute a significant project component of the original plan, which involved the construction and upgrade of a Wallaby fence, which was the reason for the status of that project being amber. Over the course of May, the team agreed with MPI to redirect those resources towards an expanded toxin program for the 2022 winter. With agreement from MPI to progress this, the status of the project was changed to green. However, there is a point of correction I'd like to make in relation to the Wallaby report on page 58, which is in more expanded detail. The first bullet point notes that we would have spent 2.4 million and committed an additional 1.4, which totals 3.8 million and exceeds our total budget of 3.35. The correction I need to make is that the committed figure was the spend committed through to the end of August and not the end of the financial year, and hence includes on the ground work in the coming financial year. So I'd like to apologise for that correction needing to be made. With regards to our expected financial position for year end on 30th of June, as of today, expenditure on the project is running approximately 2.5 to 3 weeks behind schedule, where we thought we would be. And given that the winter program is spending about 650,000 per month, we do expect that there will be 450,000 underspent at year end. I'll just note that that project is funded in advance from MPI, so that's the value of we won't be able to recognise that amount of revenue until that work is completed.
To keep backing up and clarifying, so the approximate 2.4 million spent to date is to date, and the 1.4 is.
Apologies. That 1.4 million was committed spend to the end of the toxin program, which is at the end of August. So is our budget for this financial year.
This financial year, so end of June versus
Correct.
August, which takes account end of June versus August, which takes account for the difference of the numbers.
So we previously talked to the committee, and the committee has asked questions about ensuring that we report not only on a financial year but also on a program year basis or a program basis. And I think that this illustrates the benefit of moving to that. We will be looking to start bringing that type of information in a emerging, developing form from the August meeting this year. But I think that this illustrates that benefit of not only focusing on the financial year in question, but equally and probably more importantly, the overall programme that we commit to in any of our major areas of spend.
One more clarification for me before you continue. So the 450 underspend is underspend by a due date. but we have an expectation that we will spend that money, or is that money just going to go into the ether?
That is part of the committed spend through to the end of August. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just clarify? Is there any evidence that you're aware of that these projects are going to be running at deficits over the life of them, the project, not looking at this on a financial year basis? I raise that because we are obliged to recognise any losses as soon as we become aware of them.
No, I'm not aware of any forecast losses.
Thank you. And given that this reporting was somewhat confused and that you were reporting apples compared to oranges, are you confident that that's not the case with any other of these COVID projects?
I am confident that that's not the case with the other COVID projects.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Carry on.
Just a few other points I just like to raise for the committee. The report notes that the Wilding and Wallaby projects were adjusting to the loss of a key staff member due to a significant illness. I'd like to note that in early June, the CE has approved the recruitment of additional staff for these programs, which will significantly mitigate risks to those programs. And the other program which was of most significant concern at this time is the Rangitata flood recovery program, where we have yet to secure agreements from all agencies for the work program on the lower reaches of the river. However, discussions are progressing, and also staff are working on an alternative project which could substitute for that work as a fallback. There's one other minor point of clarification I'd like to draw the committee's attention to, relating to the chart on page 49. That is a Gantt chart showing the status of the flood recovery project, which on reflection doesn't include dividers between the different programs very clearly. I had a question that was raised related to the Rangitata flood recovery project. And there is a grey box on there titled Master Planning. That master planning work actually refers to the region-wide planting and berm transition program, not to the Rangitata project. And so we'll include clearer dividing lines for future iterations of that chart. And that's, yeah, I'm happy to take further questions through the chair.
Thank you, Nick. Councillor Mackay.
Just a point of clarification. On the table on page 57, on the right-hand column of narrative, the first bullet point refers to the final agreement with landowners in the lower Waitaki. I'm presuming that is what you've just referenced being the lower Rangitata.
No.
Or are we? I know that we split some funding. Are we still actually talking about Waitaki work and Rangitata work in the same group here?
Through the chair, thank you for the opportunity to clarify that. The and somewhat confusingly, the Rangitata flood recovery program does include some work on the lower Waitaki, and so yeah, that work. Part of work stream 2 is undertaken on the lower Waitaki, and there are still some outstanding negotiations with a small number of landowners on those works.
Is it possible then, and I'm well aware of the conversation and the permissions and to do that work, to move out of the Rangitata to do some of that work, but I just wonder if it wouldn't be appropriate just to break it out or sub-clause within that to just clearly identify where those monies are going so that it's in plain public view.
Yeah, through the chair, certainly we can look at that. Those are the, I suppose, the funding packages that MB is using, and so there is a but we can certainly look to provide some clarification, even breaking up the work streams within it, such that that is more clearly identified.
I think I'm more than happy if we just break out a couple of those work streams and say, well, it's 80 or 90% is rangatata, but with these permissions, we are doing this work that sits within the rangatata box, but just identifies that some of it has been transferred out, just for that clarity.
Thank you, Chair. Just following up on your last explanation about wallaby control, on page 57, it says total program funding 3.6 million. But we've heard from you previously that what's spent and committed is 3.8. So on that basis, looking at a complete project basis, that would suggest that this program is still making a loss or deficit. And you gave me an assurance just before that you're not aware of any.
I suspect that the difference with that figure is that we also have internal funded work. So look, with respect to the chair, I'll happy to go back and clarify as to whether or not that includes the ECan funded versus the MPI funded work. But as I say, I would stand by the previous statement I made. I'm not aware that this program is making a loss.
Yeah, can I just raise again what I did in the workshop yesterday? I have real concerns about these COVID projects, that they are being poorly reported. And it's very difficult for these committees to really get a real handle on where they are and what the exposures of the council are. And I just would encourage, I think there needs to be a greater effort. I don't care if it's less reporting, but it needs to be very clear as to where we are in terms of the things we've committed to do and what it's costing us to do it.
Thank you, Graham, and it's a point well made. I do struggle with one set of numbers and the next page has a slightly different set. So if we can get that clarity of information coming through, I think it ultimately serves us all well and takes some of the tension out of the room if we can clearly see it.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, in a similar vein, really, on page 58, it would be really helpful under the region-wide river boom transition project to actually, because I understand there's multiple projects that are being undertaken as part of that. It would be really good to include in that information a summary line of each of those projects, what money's committed in terms of the budget for each, and where are we at with program, and what's the, just so we're highlighting exactly how that 10 million's being spent and where and on what projects. That would be useful if that can happen.
I do wonder, have we not seen that information and had it circulated through this committee and catchment committees?
I'm not asking for the full information. I'm asking for a breakdown of project number 1. This is the expenditure where we are today. Project number 7. This is where it is. I'm sure MB is not giving us this money as one great big slush fund. Have we not identified specific projects for it? In which case, identify where the money's being spent.
I believe that we have identified that and that we have had those reports. I think ultimately that comes back to the catchment committee or other committees. If there are exceptions or challenges or risk, then back to here. But I'm not sure that we need to be re-litigating on a constant basis.
So I just said, where are we at this month with those projects? This is a matter of finances for this committee to assess and review. Maybe the catchment committee gets the same information, I don't know, but I'm just saying that this is a finance committee and we need to understand how that $10 million is being spent.
So as we previously indicated to the committee, and I mentioned earlier this afternoon, the intention is starting in the next financial year to bring more of a portfolio view of the critical programs and projects across the whole council, indicating which committees those are reported to in terms of subject matter focus. That report inevitably will be at a higher level, providing an overview for this committee at an enterprise level, given the role of audit, finance and risk being council-wide. And therefore, we will be providing a broader range of projects, but to less depth. If that's not what the committee wants to see, then that would be good to know. From my professional view, that is what an audit committee should be focused on, with individual committees looking at the individual projects in their area of focus, so that we actually recognise the different lenses that the different committees place on the information provided.
Last point.
I'm dissatisfied with the lack of response, so I'd like my dissatisfaction at the lack of information to be noted, and hope that some consideration could be given for a list of those projects at our next meeting.
Duly noted. Councillor Mackenzie, do you have anything?
Well, I think I've got quite a lot of positive stuff to say about this conversation. That's right. So the role of this committee, as the two Grahams are quite clearly identified, is to expose the risk. And they've asked the appropriate questions, and Nick has done his best to answer appropriately. And that is the same reports that Jan and I, as chairs of the catchment committee, have had from those COVID projects that to do with river and boom protection, not the wallaby and the wilding pines. And that I can confirm that our information is that there is no outstanding liabilities of commitments to perform to meet our requirements, for which we haven't got the budgeted money to do. That is the best of our information. In terms of the reporting that Grant Edge is requiring, that has actually all been put through the catchment committee. He's a member of that catchment committee. That information has also come to council, and as far as I know, the council is about as up to date with that reporting as they could be. So that information has been tabled. It's in the public domain, and that should be enough to satisfy the councillors.
Kia ora, Nick. I'm just looking at the Horswell Huratini on page 45 and 57. You just got there MB have been formally approved the new time frame, and because I've been part of the rating district, and I know we've talked about it there, but you say however the timeline for delivery remains challenging. Have MB said, like, if it goes one more year, that's it, or they kind of indicated that we know there's issues regarding flooding and other things, and but yeah, if they went one more year, what would MB say?
Through the chair, MB, that project, when it was originally funded by MB, was given a very specific time frame. MB have actually, within MB's finances, have actually put that funding into the I think it's the Boom Transition Project, which has got a longer time frame. So whilst we still have a 12-month period by which we're looking to complete that, the funding still fits within the overall. Well, all of that COVID funding money has to be spent within the COVID funding envelope, but the time frame for that one has been pushed out a year, and yeah, so it won't be able to go beyond the end of the hard stop for that COVID funding project. So we will be looking to, but it has dropped out 12 months from its original window.
And just on that, what is that date now?
I believe it's the end of this coming financial year, so not June. I think it's 1 July, but I'd like to confirm that.
But there is reasonable confidence, isn't there, that that project will be completed within the timeframes, Nick?
I think we have through the chair, we have the status of that project as being amber, because there are 2 or 3 different designs being trialled and prototyped, and so there is a risk around being able to finalise a design in sufficient time to get some of those require consent, some don't. So there is some uncertainty around the timeframe, which is why the status of that project is amber.
Thank you. Any further questions of clarification or questions? If not, then could I have someone please move and second the recommendation that will pop onto your screens? Notes the report of the current status of Environment Canterbury's COVID-19 recovery projects. Moved by Graham McGlynn, Graham Naylor second. Those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. Thank you, Nick. We now move to item 8.6, public transport performance. Stuart.
Good to go to everybody. I'd like to take the paper as read. I'm hoping to get some indulgence from the committee this afternoon. Quite a few things I'd like to cover, which might take a little bit of time. You'll note in this report it has quite a lot of performance information. Given this is the last report for the fiscal year that you'll receive, I felt it was appropriate that you got some insights into the delivery side of public transport for the year and how we've been performing. So from a finance point of view, you'll note that we are running an operating deficit of $2.9 million year to date, with a forecast deficit of 4.1 by the end of the year, driven by COVID disruptions in terms of reduced patronage and fare revenue, but also through increased inflationary costs through the NZTA index and the unbudgeted living wage adjustments, which you'll be aware of. Because of those deficits, we have been using our public transport reserves at a higher rate than was forecast in the long-term plan. PT reserves are forecast to finish at $4.2 million for the year, and it was budgeted to be 6.6, so an increase in the usage of the reserves. It's an important piece of information to remember. I'll come back to that later on. In terms of page 65, there's a graphic there talking about the levels of service for council for the public transport portfolio. And you'll see that in the majority of cases, we are reaching our targets of service delivery, which is an excellent outcome given the challenges we've had this year. I would like to talk about the item in the top left corner in particular, which relates to percentage of trips starting on time. You'll note there are two measures there. One at 95%, which is meets the targeted service delivery threshold for PT, and one that is 90%, which does not. We've decided to report two numbers. The top number, the 95%, is a measure against the schedule that is currently in operation. Councillors might be aware that we reduced some of the services in our schedule due to driver shortages. And so that measure accounts for that reduced schedule, but also accounts for missed trips generated from the driver shortage. So at this stage, we are tracking on target, even though we are missing some trips. The second measure seeks to provide us an insight into the reduced level of service our community is getting against our normal timetables that we would otherwise be running. So obviously we're not meeting that target because we have implemented a revised timetable this year. So on page 67, at the top of the page, there's a chart there that tracks those two numbers. And so to give you a bit of explanation of in particular, the dips below the green line, which is the target we're trying to achieve. If we look at the red line that relates to our normal weekday timetable that we would like to be running, you can see in August a significant dip because we had a lockdown and had to reduce our timetables to Saturday timetables. That's why that's significantly lower. In November and December, we reduced our timetables again to Saturday due to driver shortages, and through to January, and returned to a compromised timetable in February. And in April and May, it is below the line, again, because of driver shortages and trips not actually running. blue line represents the measure, as I said, against the timetable that we are published and are running now. And the dips below the green line directly relate to driver shortages and trips not being able to run. And if you average those two lines out across the year, you get the 95 or 90% number for the year. So in terms of reporting level of service to our community, we will be using the 95% line because that reflects the services we are running and delivering in the timetable that is published. On page 67, there's a chart relating to tracking patronage using pre-COVID patronage numbers of 2019 as our benchmark or baseline, so we can understand the impact of the 50% fare reduction that is currently in play across the motu. And you can see there, if we take the green vertical line as the commencement of the 50% fare reduction, being 1 April, that the trend of patronage is going in the right direction, and that is getting up and closer to pre-COVID numbers. Just to put that in context, for the year January 2022 to 31st of March, we were running at 61% of pre-COVID numbers. For April, when the 50% fare commenced, and recognising that we have Easter and school holidays in April, we were running at 66.4 of pre-COVID numbers, so an increase of 5%. In May, we achieved 74.6% versus pre-COVID numbers, so a good positive jump. And for the first 2 weeks in June, we're currently sitting at 77%. So that represents a 16% swing to the before the 50% fare reduction came into force. It's a very, very encouraging response from our community to a fare reduction, and I think gives us confidence that the modelling we've been doing for the fare trial that Council has approved in the annual plan to commence in February will deliver the results that we're expecting. Just a reminder that the fare trial modelling we've done anticipates a 13% swing or uplift in patronage. And we deliberately did our modelling conservatively. So that it's good to see that level of community response in Greater Christchurch.
That's a question. So we've got the half year trial, which runs for another month or so, and then we revert to the normal, and then February back in again with our trial. Do you have any sense or of what might happen in that intervening period? Do you think that having got people back on buses, they will continue, or fall off before we go back to the trial space? And I know it's crystal ball gazing.
Yeah, I don't have that insight, but I would make the following comments. In terms of changing people's behaviour in the long term, you need to have a longer period of time of a different dynamic. So the 50% fare reduction that government have implemented from April to August, while it's fantastic, it's not a very long period of time to embed behaviour change. So we would expect to see some people changing their behaviours back in the interim period. The fare trial that Council have approved in the annual plan is for 2 years, and our view is a significantly good period of time to embed good behaviour change. What is interesting to note, though, with the 50% fare reduction is the significant uplift in usage from youth or child fares, which we reported to Council at their last meeting. And that's quite important because children don't have as many choices in the way they travel. And with the price of fuel, I'm sure that's going to influence how parents determine how their children will get around, or in fact, how parents and people will get around anyway. So the combination of high fuel prices, along with 4 months or so of reduced bus fare costs, may keep people on the bus through to February. I suspect that some won't. That's my prediction. I'd like now to turn to page 73, which talks about risks. I'll deal with the second risk first, because we've mentioned driver shortages.
No, we'll finish that one off and then go to questions. Sorry.
Sorry, thank you. You'll be aware that nationally there is a driver shortage in public transport and actually a number of other transport industries in New Zealand, which is impacting on the ability of public transport authorities to deliver reliable timetable services. We are seeing significant driver shortages and timetable impacts in Greater Christchurch, in Wellington, in Auckland, in Hamilton, in Tauranga, in Dunedin, and in Hawke's Bay. In talking to our colleagues around the motu, we note that we seem to be getting off relatively lightly. And in saying that, though, we are missing on average between 3 to 5% of our trips due to driver shortages. So it's not an insignificant number, but not nearly as big as some of our other public transport authorities. This problem is not going to go away in the short term. We, in our industry conversations in the last month, there is a view that it may last for another 12 to 18 months until such time as interventions that are made work their way through to an outcome. So as you'll note in the risk statement, having a driver shortage impacts on the confidence that our community has with our service. And it impacts on our ability to deliver service uplifts. If we can't obtain enough drivers to run our current service, we're going to struggle to obtain drivers to run increased services. So as you know, Council have approved funding and we've engaged with the community to do service uplifts for routes 17 and 28, starting early in 2023. And we as a team have been preparing for that. But we are considering the timing of when we should enter into contracts for those service uplifts, because those contracts will necessitate procurement of additional vehicles. If those vehicles are not in use, then we will have to pay for them. So we are starting to think about appropriate timing to do that procurement, and that may ultimately influence the timing of the uplift, service uplift delivery. We're also considering developing a reduced weekday timetable that better aligns with the resource capacity we have available to us. The purpose of that is to try and reduce the uncertainty for our community by actually having missed trips. So if we produce a more deliverable timetable, then we should have less, or ideally no, missed trips. So that work is about to commence. The first risk relates to Whakamutunga funding for COVID shortfalls. And you'll note in the commentary throughout the year that Whakamutunga committed to fund their share of the fair revenue shortfall, being 51% of it, through to the end of June this year. After producing this paper, we received some communications from Whakamutunga regarding what will happen next. I'll just read some key points from that communication so you can get a view of where they're sitting. So from 1 July, normal funding arrangements for the PT continuous program will resume. What they're saying is that their specific focus on COVID as a disruptor and separated funding will be removed. Whakamutunga will maintain normal FAR, financial assistance rates, contributions towards the continuous program, including the gap between budget and actual net costs. We will no longer be specifically funding extra COVID-19 costs, such as intensive cleaning, and you'll note that Council took that out of their annual plan budget recently. Work and options for managing the pressures across the National Land Transport Fund will be presented to the Whakamutunga Board at their next meeting in July, with final decisions likely to follow in August or September. As soon as practical, they will advise PTAs how Whakakote intend to manage this funding pressure. So, what that says to us is, until we hear a formal decision from the Whakakote board, we will continue to claim their 51% of the cost of running PT, and we would expect them to continue to pay. So for July and August at least, we would expect to continue to receive their contribution. But obviously there's some significant decisions being made in July at the board, and that will be communicated to us in August or September. Within our annual plan, as you know, we anticipated a positive and a negative outcome from this discussion. And we are relying on our reserves should Whakakote not be able to fund this year. So I come back to my point about the reserves earlier on, finishing the year at $4.2 million. If Whakakote do not meet their 51% share, then we will need to find some more money, approximately $1.5 million we're forecasting. That will leave our reserves with a deficit of $300,000 at the end of the fiscal year. So, as we've already advised to council through the annual plan process, no other demands are being placed on the PT reserve at this time to anticipate the potential for this situation to occur. I'm going to stop talking there. Questions?
Councillor Mackay, followed by Mackenzie. I've upset her, so just the sooner she gets a question in, the better.
He did upset me too, because I'm going to take you right back. Just with regard to the uptick and or the uplift on it, that's really quite promising, as you say, Stuart. On page 69, the bus patronage across Auckland, Greater Wellington and Greater Christchurch. Oh no, that's not the one I was looking at. It was the one where you said that the May figures hadn't come through yet. Oh, maybe it is that one. No, the one above it has the bigger tick up on the end. But have you received the figures? I mean, are we comparable to what's happening in Auckland and Wellington? Have you had an update since this paper was written?
I personally haven't seen those numbers yet. I would note though, if we look at the chart on page 69, which is similar information but represented slightly differently. I did comment in the commentary here that the trajectory of Wellington and Auckland since the introduction of 50% fares is steeper than Greater Christchurch. And the primary reason for that is the demographic and geography in Wellington and Auckland is somewhat different to Christchurch. We don't have the congestion that Auckland and Wellington do. We don't have the parking prices that Auckland and Wellington do. And we don't have the density of employment that Auckland and Wellington do. And so that fare reduction has had a more positive impact in those two urban centres than it has in Christchurch. Noting that they were coming off a lower base than us as well.
Thank you, Councillor Mackenzie.
Thank you, Chairman John. The urgency of me getting to me is I start to forget what my question was. But, Stuart, you talked about predicting a 30 or budgeting for 30% increase in patronage. So just to get that clear, is that based on pre-50% fare levels, or is it post? So are we hoping to get to 100%, or are we only going to get back to the high 70s again? And then a supplementary question after that, please.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So in the annual plan, the baseline assumption we have made is that patronage would start at 25% below pre-COVID numbers. So that means that if we look at these relationships, we will be sitting at 75% of patronage off. And so if we look at the trajectories, they tend to suggest we're heading to that place. And so the modelling we've done assumes uplift on top of that number.
So that'll close to 100% pre-COVID numbers. So my second question really is, and it's to do with this risk of not recovering the money from Whakamutunga, but it's also the risk that we won't get the patronage to meet our fare box recovery targets. So what percentage of pre-COVID patronage do we need to be at to meet, to not drag further into our reserves and meet our fare box recovery so that the current funding package is sufficient to meet our requirements?
The answer to that's complex. In deciding to do a fare trial and reducing the fare set, effectively you are accepting a reduced fare box recovery number because you are using your money instead of the commuter's money to pay for the service. So when the fare trial commences, the fare box, there isn't actually a fare box target anymore. You'll recall a few years ago, the fare box target was 50%, and that has now been removed by government. Our fare box pre-COVID was sitting at 37%, and then COVID has taken us down to 21%. I think it mentions that in this document. So with the fare trial, we will go below that 21%. The expectation from the modelling that we've done and the fiscal envelopes that we've created in the annual plan is that we will drive a 13% increase in patronage, but we're effectively buying that with the funding we've put into it. What that means is our fare box will be less than 21%. I don't know what that number is off the top of my head, but that will, if you join that conversation together, you'll be able to calculate what a fare box number target looks like if we got a 13% uplift with the money we're spending. So we'll be able to find out what that number is, but I don't know what it is off the top of my head.
Thanks, Cheers. Just a thanks for the report. It's really good. Just a quick comment at the beginning on page 72 that the positive outcomes from the My Way project in South Canterbury is a good picture for us. My questions are really related to your assessment of the uplift in patronage from young people. When the gold card incentive takes hold, will you be able to keep track of the uplift in gold card users over that trial period?
Yes, we will. And just to clarify, the change in the Super Gold access and fare is not part of the fare trial. It's a permanent change that council have made. But yes, we will be able to report on that.
You mentioned the loss of. Sorry, and you mentioned a loss of 3 to 5% in trips. Are the trips that are being lost, are they in peak time or through the day, or
Chair, the disruption to our service is across the day and particularly acute in the weekends. And the reason for that is that with the number of drivers we have, they are only able to drive a certain number of hours. And so we are trying to make sure they focus obviously in our peak periods as much as possible, which means when they come to the weekend, many drivers have run out of hours. And so it disrupts the weekend. But we are seeing disruption in the mornings. We are seeing disruption in our peaks. We are seeing disruption in the evenings and in the weekends.
Yeah, just to add a comment to about the fare box recovery. One of the things, of course, is looking at the short term. We're looking at that taking a hit on the fare box, but very much for the long term perspective that we're trying to drive more use of public transport for decades. This is where we have to go for the whole of our future. So That's got to be kept in mind. And there is a point, there must be a tipping point where actually there's enough use and enough to kind of completely overcome many of the negativities of having car transport and fossil fuels and all the costs of climate change and all those things. So it's in that context, it's important to remember. My question though was that we actually do have one part of our community that are going to have an ongoing fare cut, which is our tertiary students, and it's going to be fairly similar. It's going to go to the childfare from July, so it's $1.50 instead of the half price current, which is $1.30. My understanding is we're going to have communication, like a good communications program around that, working with the universities. So we've got that behaviour change push from that comms and support, as well as maintaining that. And I'm just wondering, is there going to be anything coming out of that that we can use to inform what we do come February time? Will we be able to track any of that change in terms of how maybe that cohort of tertiary students maintain their bus use or pick up their bus use, given that we'll have both that lower fare, maintaining that lower fare plus comms, and how that might be, differentiate from those who've gone from a half price back up to a full price, and then so I'm just wondering if there's anything useful that we might be able to capture in that data during that period of time.
We'll let them think about it, because I'm not sure it's something for this committee. And we've had a nice conversation about identifying a whole lot of challenges, but for me, sitting here as the chair of this Audit and Risk Committee, we have the very significant risk now of our reserves running into a negative balance to achieve the outcomes that we have, and we have the very real risk of not being able to implement our services, which then get up the backs of people and folk. So yes, I understand, the bus doesn't turn up and annoys me, but if the bus only turns up every half hour and I'm used to 15 minutes, it equally annoys me. So my question, Stuart, is what mitigations are you thinking about, or options do we have to mitigate the risk, given this is a risk committee as opposed to identifying the issues? That's the nub for me.
Thank you. So there are a number of things happening at the moment in that regard. There is an industry work group which involves central government, public transport authorities, operators and driver unions, engaged in a collaborative discussion to identify and understand what levers we should pull or could pull to make public transport driving a more attractive vocation. And the sorts of levers that are being talked about relate to driver wages, driver employment conditions, in particular the quantum of split shifts that might operate in a network. And that particular issue, if I just dive into that a little bit, is quite variable across the country. So in Auckland, they have a very high rate of split shifts. In Wellington, they've done quite a bit of work to take their high rate down to a more tolerable rate. In Greater Christchurch, our rate of split shifts today is not very high, but it is something we will look at. And then if you go to the smaller regions, it's marginal. So wages, conditions, driver facilities on the network. So in some places in the country, it is difficult for a driver to find a bathroom when they're on their route. And that, as you can well understand, can be quite challenging. And so there is some work to do in understanding, do we have, in our context, do we have sufficient availability of restrooms, facilities across our network? And if we don't, where those holes are and how we might go about fixing those. Those are and the fourth thing is driver safety. Our population, not just in Greater Christchurch, but across the country, have been through a lot in the last 2 years. And we know, we see it on the news, we know from speaking to our colleagues and speaking to police and other social agencies that that our community's mental capacity and tolerance to deal with difficulty is being tested. And that is manifesting itself in antisocial behaviour in public facilities, including public transport. So the drivers are rightly concerned about their safety. So those are the four things that are being talked about, and trying to identify how we might get the mix right of a response. You'll note that in the government budget in May the 19th, there was an announcement made of $61 million over 4 years to support a resolution of driver shortage issue. That translates to $15 million a year over 4 years, which is not a large sum of money. So this working group and ultimately Whakamutunga are tasked with determining how to apply those funds, and then make a proposal to the Minister of Transport. And if he is satisfied with that proposal, he will release the money. And then we will be able to determine how to apply it in Greater Christchurch. So there's work underway. It is unclear as to when that work will be finished and what the outcome of it will be. And thus, in the meantime, we have to do our best to work with what we've got. And so, in our case, we are commencing a process to develop an alternative timetable that works with the resources we have available.
Thanks, Stuart. And very briefly, the reduction of funding from Whakamutunga falling back and the impact on our reserves going forward. If we're running into a negative, where does that take us a further 12 months down? Where are we at before we just move on?
So at the moment, as I say, assuming that Whakamutunga meet their 51% share, our reserves will finish at the end of the year 2 at $1.2 million. And just a reminder, our reserve policy is $4.2 million for PT reserves. If Whakamutunga do not meet their 50% contribution for the entire year, we would be at negative 300k. Now, I said to you earlier, based on the information we've received, that we expect to receive their contribution for July and August. So that's that $300,000. So we may end up at zero, not negative. But of course, once we move forward, year 3 onwards, we need to fill up that reserve again.
Thank you, Stuart. Any further questions, Graham McGlynn, before we move on?
Thank you for the report, and congratulations on actually presenting a report that really gives this committee a good look with a pair of binoculars on at what might be coming at us. It does allow us then to be monitoring this and working with you and your team to be looking at implications on stated council policy, what's happening, and whether the council needs to go back and have a think about these things. And with PT being one of the largest parts of our expenditure and also having multiple levers, all of them with risks on them, I think this is an area that we're going to have to at future meetings been keeping a very, very close eye on it. So thank you for the binoculars. It's given a real insight.
Kia ora, Stuart, just carrying on from the chair, just regarding the funding from He Whakamutunga. Stuart, can you just clarify how it works? So the minister, Michael Woods, kind of gives a putia to Whakamutunga, and then the board, do they sit down and decide where that kind of the PT funding is going, or is that and then it comes to us, or are we at the whim of the board, or how does that work?
Mr. Chair. So in the case of COVID response, the government created a bucket of money as a response to COVID disruption. And that bucket of money was used in the public transport space to maintain existing service contracts with the primary purpose of being able to come out of COVID with a network that we could stand up again. And so government were particularly interested in ensuring that we didn't lose drivers, we didn't lose vehicles, we didn't lose operators by having them go bust. And so they underwrote effectively the public transport system through the COVID funding. Now that's important because under normal circumstances, the National Land Transport Fund is the source of funding for public transport from government. And you'll recall through various other conversations we've had over the last wee while, the National Land Transport Fund is under extreme fiscal pressure. Whakamutunga is challenged to be able to meet its committed obligations the next funding period. And so they are having to make some decisions on how the funding that's available in the National Land Transport Fund will be used. And so this is the decision they're going to need to make in July, because the COVID bucket doesn't exist anymore, so that source of funding is gone. The reduced fare revenue that the country is experiencing was not anticipated in the National Land Transport Fund. So they are short of money. So they will need to determine whether there are other mechanisms within the National Land Transport Fund that enables them to meet their commitments to public transport or not. So the things they might, I'm speculating here, but they might choose to not do some projects that they had intended to do to release that money. One of the other complexities, though, in the National Land Transport Fund is it is also split into buckets of money. So there's a bucket for the Public Transport Continuous Program, which is what we draw out of. There's a bucket for roading maintenance infrastructure. There's a bucket for capital projects. There's a bucket for safety. Whakamutunga are not able to transfer money from one bucket to another. It is not an option that they can choose. The last challenge that they have is they had to obtain approval from government for this period, this NLTF, to borrow $2 billion to top up the NLTF to deliver their program. So it's a challenge for them. That doesn't really help us, and we would like them to meet their commitments to us. So that is what the conversation I imagine will be with the board, is how are they going to meet their commitments given the exceptional pressures they have on their bucket of money for PT.
So pre-COVID, what was so recently we've had 51%. What was percentage of funding before that?
So prior to Omicron popping its head up, the government funded 100% of the fare loss to a point in time. And then we started to move out of all the lockdowns and back into some semblance of normality. And then the rules were changed, and it was they was going to pay 51% of that fare loss, and we had to contribute 49%. So prior to that point, they underwrote PT by 100%. And then they changed it to 51%. That was only until December last year, and then they extended it to June this year because of Omicron. And now that the COVID bucket of money is gone, they are, well, where they will get their money from is the question to be asked.
Thank you, Councillor Edge. Last question on this matter.
I suppose, I mean, I know in your page 73, you've identified the risk rating as high, but has Whakamutunga ever not funded their 51%?
I think through you, Mr. Chair, to answer that question, I'd have to say that Whakamutunga have not been in this place before, where they have had such a disruptive event to an activity class that they fund. They have not been in a place where they have had to borrow $2 billion to deliver their work program. Prior to this NLTF and the one just before it, typically the NLTF ran with a surplus because they were unable to spend all the money they had. projects were delayed, projects took longer, and what have you. So they were able to cover incidental disruption. But the quantum of the disruption for COVID, being a national disruption, has been such that they have relied on government to help them meet their obligations. That support is now gone, and they are severely tested fiscally. So I say again, they haven't been in this position before. So to date, we have not had commitments made to us that they have not met. But that has been an environment where they have not been challenged in this way.
Thank you, Stuart, for that response and for the paper that you have presented to us. And I guess we look forward to the further conversation of the Public Transport Committee and an understanding of whether we can resolve some of these issues and where we end up travelling. But I think this committee does take a significant interest in the risk that is genuinely associated with public transport. It is a significant, or the most significant part of our operations, and the challenges that sit before us are quite stark if things do not go our way. So thank you for that. Could I have someone then please move the resolution that is on our screens? And a seconder, Graham McGlynn, seconded Councillor Southworth. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. Thank you, Stuart. We are now at the point of moving to public excluded, which is effectively the second half of our meeting. Are you interested in having a 5-minute break and then rolling through the second half of the meeting? Thank you. So we will take a 5-minute adjournment. Is 25th August at 10 a.m. Might I just posit that I am available, and I know the Grahams are probably available somewhere in the interim if there is the wish for a workshop conversation between a number of us just working forward. So I note that availability, given that's a couple of months before our next official meeting. So I make that offer on our behalf. Is that suitable? Just for any particular conversation that you might like. So thank you all for your participation at the formal meeting. As is now practice, we will have a meeting with our internal chap, John Gamba. Hopefully he's saved his voice till the very end. We will not have our internal auditors with us today, as John wants to just have a conversation with us, the committee, on his own. So thank you again. We're within time, which is always useful. And we will begin our conversation when folks have left. Did I want to close with a Karakia? I'm sorry, yes.
Wondering whether it would be more appropriate to do it before everybody left. And with your indulgence, given that we are on the eve of Matariki and the significance of it being our first Matariki as a country and a people, and given that we've been told today that our Maori cousins are much better behaved in celebrating Matariki than some of the other cultures that make up New Zealand, our multicultural society, given the emergence of Pleiades, as I understand it, the Northern Hemisphere coincided with spring celebrations, and the Germans in particular were very badly behaved over those spring celebrations. So I've chosen the Karakia, which perhaps might reflect our minds about how we should learn to behave from, as I say, from and our Maori cousins rather than some of our pagan ancestors from the Northern Hemispheres. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te atawhai, oto tātou ariki, a ihu kara iti, nei te arawa, o te atua, nei te whiwhi, ngata hitanga, ki te wairua tapu, aki, amen.